The day we buried Leander, I wore his favorite color, black. Not because it was tradition, because I already knew what was coming. Odile showed up 3 days after the funeral, not to ask how I was, not to grieve. She came with a lawyer, a leather folder, and a number. $2 million. She said it was hers. I didn't argue. I didn't call my own lawyer. I just said, "You should speak to Rafferty Cole." She smiled. She thought she had already won. She had no idea that Leander, quiet, careful, brilliant Leander, had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. Greenwich in November smells like wet stone and wood smoke. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, it simply settles. The way grief does into the spaces between your ribs before you've even noticed. I remember standing at the edge of the cemetery, my heels pressing into the softened earth, and thinking how appropriate it was that the sky refused to be dramatic about it. No breaking clouds, no cinematic light, just a flat, pewter gray stretching from one end of the horizon to the other, muted and final, the way Leander himself would have preferred. He never liked spectacle. He would have approved of that sky. I had known Leander Voss for 26 years and been married to him for 22 of them. That is not a small number. 22 years is a language of its own, a private grammar of shorthand glances across dinner tables, of knowing which silences mean peace and which mean thought, of understanding a man so completely that you can read the shape of his stillness. I knew when he was worried by the way he held his coffee cup in both hands. I knew when he was proud by the particular stillness of his jaw. And I knew 2 years before the doctors confirmed anything, that something was changing inside him because the way he looked at me began to hold a quality I had never seen before. Not fear. Something more deliberate than fear. Something that looked, in retrospect, like preparation. We had built a life in this corner of Connecticut that was modest in appearance and substantial in truth. The house on Alderton Road, a federal-style colonial, white-clapboard, black shutters, roses along the garden wall that Leander had planted. The spring we moved in was not a mansion. It was not meant to impress. It was meant to endure. The floors were original, dark, wide plank oak, and they creaked in the same places every morning. A kind of household music I never tired of. The kitchen smelled of espresso and lemon wood polish. The library held 412 books, a number I know precisely because I cataloged them the winter before Leander became too tired to read. Small dignities matter when larger ones begin to slip away. I am 58 years old. I have been described, and not always charitably, as composed, reserved, cold, by those who mistook restraint for indifference. What those people never understood is that precision is not the absence of feeling. It is the discipline of feeling. There is a difference between a woman who has nothing to say and a woman who has chosen, with great care, not to say it yet. I learned that distinction from Leander, who was the quietest, brilliant man I have ever known, and I learned it early enough to let it become my nature rather than my strategy. The funeral was well attended, as the funerals of respected men tend to be. Colleagues from his years at the investment firm, neighbors who had watched our garden grow for 2 decades, a few old friends from his university days who traveled considerable distances to stand in the November cold and say the things people say. I received their condolences with a steady hand and a steady voice, because Leander deserved a widow who did not unravel publicly, and because, if I am honest, the acute, jagged phase of my grief had arrived much earlier in the small hours of ordinary nights, and had already begun its long transformation into something quieter and more permanent. Odile stood at the back of the gathering. She did not stand near me. She had not stood near me in years. Not truly, not since the early days when proximity was necessary for appearances. She was wearing a coat I recognized as new, charcoal wool, well cut. The kind of purchase that suggests someone has recently decided to invest in a particular impression. She was 34 years old, and she had her father's jaw in her mother's eyes. And she had spent the better part of a decade treating me with the particular brand of politeness that is designed to remind its recipient that it is a performance. I watched her from across the cemetery with the same steady attention I might give a weather front forming on the horizon. Present, noted. Not yet arrived. What I felt in that moment was not anger. It was something older and more calibrated. When you have lived long enough alongside a man who thought carefully about everything, who filed and documented and considered consequences 3 moves ahead as naturally as other men breathe, you begin to absorb that quality. You begin to trust the architecture of things you cannot yet see. Leander had told me on a quiet evening 14 months before he died that everything was in order. Those were his exact words. Everything is in order, Thess. He said it the way a man says it when he means it in the deepest possible sense, not as reassurance, but as a completed fact. I had held those words like a stone in my pocket ever since. The drive home from the cemetery took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard, not from anxiety, but because I needed something concrete to hold on to, some small measurement of the world continuing to function by its ordinary rules. The trees along Round Hill Road had gone fully bare, their branches making clean dark lines against the gray sky, architectural and unashamed. There is a particular beauty in things stripped to their structure. Leander understood that. He built his entire professional life on the belief that the truth of anything, a balance sheet, a contract, a person, lived in its bones, not its surface. I made tea when I got home, Earl Grey, loose leaf, the way he had taught me to make it. I sat at the kitchen table in the house that smelled like him, still, seated in old books, and the faintest trace of the garden coming in through the cracked window, and I drank it slowly. And I waited, because I already knew that waiting was the only action required of me. Leander had seen to everything else. The question was never whether I would be protected. The question was only how long Odile would take to show me exactly who she had always been. Before I continue, I want to pause for just a moment and ask you something simple. Where are you watching this from tonight? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. It costs nothing, and it matters more than you might think. I find I tell this story differently depending on who I know is listening. There is a particular sound the doorbell makes when you are expecting it and dreading it.
Eu estava naquela encruzilhada, o coração pesado, mas algo me guiou. E aqui estamos nós.
Just more present, as though the
Aquele
house
detalhe da
itself has
história,
drawn a
sabe,
breath.
me marcou
That is the
profundamente.
sound I heard on the
Sabe, há
third morning
momentos na
after the
vida em que uma
funeral
escolha
at
define
11:47 in the morning.
Eu estava
When the
naquela
light through the
encruzilhada, o
front
coração
windows was
pesado,
thin
mas
and
algo me
white,
guiou.
and the
E aqui
temperature
estamos
outside
nós.
had dropped another 4 degrees overnight. I had been in the library. I had been reading nothing, holding a book, which is a different thing entirely. I set the book down on Leander's chair, the worn leather one by the east window, the one that still held the faint impression of his particular weight, and I walked to the front door without hurrying. I already knew who was there. Not because I had been told, and not because I had any extraordinary intuition, but because I had been watching Odile for 22 years and I understood the rhythm of her. She was a woman who waited for the theater of grief to settle before she walked onto the stage. 3 days was exactly right for her. Long enough to seem respectful, short enough to seem urgent. I opened the door. She was standing on the front step in that charcoal coat, and beside her was a man I did not recognize. Mid-dark suit, a leather portfolio tucked under his left arm with the practiced ease of someone who carries such things professionally. He had the careful, neutral expression of a lawyer engaged in business rather than sympathy, which told me everything I needed to know about the nature of this visit before a single word had been exchanged. Odile herself was composed, hair smooth, lipstick precise. She had prepared for this the way one prepares for a performance, not for a conversation, but for a delivery. She said, "My name." Not warmly, in the tone of someone establishing that they know exactly who they are addressing and have no illusions about the relationship. I stepped back from the door, not as an invitation, exactly, but as an acknowledgement, and they came inside. The lawyer's shoes clicked against the hardwood floor of the entryway. The house smelled of the Earl Grey I had made that morning, and beneath it, still, cedar, issue. Leander? I noticed Odile's eyes move across the room with the particular quality of assessment rather than memory. She was not looking at the house she had visited as her father's daughter. She was looking at an inventory. We sat in the front sitting room. I did not offer tea. This was not rudeness. It was accuracy. Tea is for guests who have come in good faith. I sat in the chair nearest the fireplace where the last of a low fire had burned down to orange coals, and I folded my hands in my lap and I waited. The lawyer opened his portfolio on the coffee table between us. Odile sat across from me with her back straight and her expression set into something that was almost, but not quite, compassion. It was the face of someone who has rehearsed concern. She spoke first. She said that she understood this was a difficult time. She said that she had given me space to grieve, which was generous of her, she implied, given the circumstances. Then she said that there were certain matters that required immediate attention, matters pertaining to the estate of her father, Leander Voss. She used the word her father with a particular emphasis. The kind of emphasis that is not linguistic but architectural, designed to establish a structure before the conversation has properly begun. And then she said the words I had been waiting for, the words she had no doubt practiced in the mirror of whatever hotel room or borrowed apartment she had come from that morning. She called me the second wife. Not Thessaly, not his wife, the second wife. She said it the way one might say a temporary arrangement or a clerical matter, with brisk, dismissive efficiency, as though the 22 years I had spent building a life beside her father were a footnote rather than a chapter, a placeholder rather than a fact. She said it in front of the lawyer, who continued writing without looking up. She said it in my house, in front of Leander's fireplace, within earshot of his books and his chair and the roses he had planted along the garden wall. I felt the words land. I felt exactly what they were designed to make me feel, and I chose, with complete deliberateness, to let them pass through me without purchase. The lawyer slid a document across the coffee table. $2 million, documented across property, investments, and accounts. Odile explained, in that same composed performance voice, that as the biological child of Leander Voss, she had a rightful claim to the entirety of her father's estate, and that she expected the matter to be resolved efficiently and without unnecessary conflict. The phrase unnecessary conflict was doing considerable work in that sentence. It was both a threat and a warning, dressed in the language of reasonableness. The lawyer produced a pen and set it beside the document without comment. The way a dealer might place a card, I looked at the document. I looked at Odile. I looked at the lawyer, who was studying a point somewhere above my left shoulder with the professional vacancy of a man paid to be present but not to fill. And then I folded my hands a fraction more deliberately in my lap, and I said the only thing I intended to say in that room, on that morning, for the entirety of that encounter. 7 words, quiet, exact. The temperature of the room dropping 2 degrees as I said them. You should speak to Rafferty Cole. Odile's smile arrived immediately. The smile of someone who believes they have already cleared the highest obstacle and are simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. She asked who Rafferty Cole was. I told her he was Leander's attorney and that he would be in touch to schedule a meeting at his earliest convenience. She glanced at her lawyer, who gave a small, assured nod that said, "Fine, we'll meet with whatever local counsel the widow has produced." She stood, collected the document I had not signed, and moved toward the door with the unhurried confidence of someone leaving a task, 3/4 complete. On the threshold, she turned back once, and the look she gave me was not hostile. It was something I found, in some ways, more instructive than hostility. It was pity. People have a way of rewriting history when money enters the room. Suddenly marriages become transactions, decades become inconveniences, and women like me become footnotes in stories we actually authored. I have watched it happen to others. I watched it happen to myself, and what I learned, what I had known, perhaps, long before the lesson was formally delivered, is that the most powerful response to having your story rewritten is to have already recorded the original in a place no one can reach. That is not strategy. That is simply the wisdom of a woman who paid attention. I was 36 years old when I met Leander Voss at a private function hosted by a mutual colleague in the West Village. This was the autumn before I turned 37, the year I had decided, with the quiet finality of someone who has done sufficient negotiating with themselves, that I was no longer interested in performing approachability for the benefit of people who hadn't earned my ease. I was at that point a senior analyst at a mid-sized asset management firm, the only woman in my division, and I had developed the particular posture of someone who has learned that a straight back and a measured silence communicate more than either aggression or charm. I was not looking for a husband. I was not looking for anything except the specific Canadian I had seen passed on a tray 30 seconds earlier and had not yet managed to intercept. Leander found that funny. That was the first thing he said to me, not a compliment, not an introduction, but a quiet observation that I appeared to be engaged in a strategic pursuit of the smoked salmon. He was standing slightly to the left of the crowd, holding a glass of still water, wearing a jacket that fit him well enough to suggest it had been chosen by someone who cared about precision but not spectacle. He was 51 then, silver at the temples, with the kind of stillness about him that rooms tend to organize themselves around without anyone noticing it's happening. I told him I had priorities. He said he appreciated that in a person. We talked for 2 hours without moving from that corner, and by the end of the evening I had the specific sensation of having been genuinely heard, not performed at, not assessed, not managed, heard. It was, I will admit, slightly disorienting. We were married 4 years later, after a courtship that Leander conducted with the same careful attention he gave everything deliberately, thoroughly, without rushing toward conclusions before the evidence was complete. He had been divorced for 11 years when we met. His marriage to Odilie's mother, Margot, had ended when Odile was 9, in the quiet, bloodless way that some marriages end when two people discover they have confused compatibility with proximity. There was no great drama. There was simply the honest acknowledgement that they had become strangers sharing a very well-appointed house, and that honesty between two practical people had been sufficient to end things cleanly. Leander spoke of Margot without bitterness and without warmth, which told me everything I needed to know about the quality of that decade. Odile was 23 when Leander and I married. She attended the ceremony, a small, private affair at a vineyard in the Litchfield Hills. 40 guests, late October, the maples at their most devastating red, and she smiled in all the photographs, with the particular smile of someone who has decided to make the best of a situation they find fundamentally objectionable. I recognized that smile. I had seen it at every family gathering for the 4 years. Leander and I had been together deployed with impressive consistency across holidays, birthdays, and the occasional accidental dinner. It was the smile of a woman who was patient, who was, in fact, waiting. I filed that observation and said nothing, because there was nothing at that point to say. What Odile never understood, what she perhaps could not have understood, given the story she had told herself about me, was that I had come into this marriage with my own resources, my own history, my own 36 years of carefully built competence. I was not a woman who had married upward. I was a woman who had merged laterally with a man of equivalent seriousness. And what we built together as two people who understood finance, understood documentation, understood the importance of putting the real things in writing. I brought my own capital to our shared life. I signed my own name on our joint investments. There was not a single asset in our portfolio that I could not account for, defend, or explain in precise detail if asked. And yet, the second wife. I have turned those words over in my mind many times since that morning in the sitting room, with the same clinical interest I might give a particularly revealing document. What they were designed to do was strip me of context to reduce 22 years to a legal category, to suggest that the word second implied lesser, as though sequence were the same as significance. But here is what Odile, in all her calculations, failed to account for. Leander had also heard those words, not from her, perhaps not spoken aloud in front of him, but he knew his daughter, he knew the architecture of her thinking. And 2 years before he died, he had gone to see Rafferty Cole. I learned this later, in full, but standing in my own sitting room that November morning, watching Odilie's charcoal coat disappear through my front door, I knew it in outline, because Leander had told me, in the way he told me everything important, without drama and without elaboration. Everything is in order, Thess. I had understood, even then, that this was not general reassurance. It was specific. It was pointed, It was Leander, in his quiet and precise way, telling me that he had already answered a question I hadn't yet been asked. The fire in the sitting room had gone fully dark by the time I heard her car leave the driveway. I sat for a long moment in the silence of the house, the tick of the hall clock, the faint creak of the floorboards settling in the cold, the smell of cedar and Earl Grey and roses going dormant in the November garden. Then I stood, straightened the document Odilie's lawyer had left behind, placed it in the drawer of the writing desk, and went to make another cup of tea. There was nothing else to do. The architecture was already in place. I only had to wait for the walls to become visible. Grief has a texture that most people don't prepare for. It isn't soft, the way the word sounds when people say it carefully at funerals. It is granular, abrasive in unexpected places, the edge of a Tuesday afternoon, the particular angle of morning light through a bedroom window, the moment you reach for a phone to tell someone something and remember, with your hand already moving, that there is no one to call. I was not unprepared for grief, but I was unprepared for how it would be used against me, how my stillness would be read by certain people as vacancy, how my composure would be recast in the weeks after Leander's burial as evidence of a woman who could be moved. The rumors began within 10 days. I know this because Constance Hawley, a neighbor of ours for 14 years, a woman of genuine if occasionally excessive goodwill, appeared at my door one Wednesday morning with a covered dish in the careful expression of someone carrying information they are not sure how to deliver. She sat at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and she told me, in the circling, apologetic way of someone who respects you enough to be honest and likes you enough to wish they didn't have to be, that there was talk, that people were saying things, that Odile had been making calls. The substance of what Odile was saying was this, that the marriage had been unequal, that Leander, in his final years, had been, she used, apparently, the word influenced by a woman whose interests were financial rather than personal, that the estate, properly understood, belonged to his blood, and that whatever legal arrangements existed had been made under conditions that a thorough examination would reveal to be questionable. She had been saying these things to the kinds of people who attend, the kinds of dinners where such things, once said, travel quickly and quietly and lodge themselves in the architecture of reputation before anyone has had the chance to respond. I listened to Constance without interrupting. I thanked her. I told her that Leander had been the most deliberate man I had ever known, and that I trusted his arrangements completely. She looked at me with something between admiration and concern, the look of someone who cannot decide whether the person across from them is enormously strong or dangerously calm. I poured her more coffee and changed the subject to her daughter's new house in Vermont, and she left 40 minutes later with the slightly unsettled air of someone who had arrived prepared to offer comfort and found they weren't needed. I stood at the kitchen window after her car had gone and watched the bear garden for a long moment and allowed myself, privately and briefly, to feel the full cold weight of what was happening. Because it was working, that is the thing about rumors carefully aimed. They do not need to be believed to be effective. They only need to be repeated. And Odile had chosen her audience with the same precision she brought to everything. People who were fond of Leander, people who had known him before me, people for whom the word second would always carry the faint suggestion of replacement rather than choice. Within 2 weeks of those initial calls, I noticed the particular quality of hesitation that enters a social interaction when someone has heard something about you and has not decided what to do with it yet. A pause before a reply. A certain careful brightness in the eyes of people who used to be unremarkable around me. An invitation that didn't come. I did not correct the record publicly. This was a choice that, I am aware, some people would have found incomprehensible, possibly. There is a certain kind of person who believes that silence is surrender, that if you do not immediately and loudly defend yourself, you are conceding the ground. I am not that kind of person, and Leander was not that kind of man. We had built our life on the understanding that the most durable response to a false accusation is a true document, and that true documents, unlike arguments, do not require an audience to be effective. I had no intention of entering a campaign of counter-narrative. I had every intention of waiting for Rafferty Cole. In the meantime, Odile escalated. Her lawyer sent 2 letters to my address, formal, precisely worded, demanding access to financial records pertaining to the estate and suggesting that an independent executor be appointed to oversee the asset review process. Both letters arrived in cream envelopes with a firm name embossed in the upper left corner in the restrained serif font of an organization that charges considerable amounts of money to project calm authority. I read each letter once, placed them in the same drawer as the unsigned document from the first visit, and noted with a private, dry appreciation that Odile was spending a great deal on a case she did not yet know she did not have, the hardest part of that period, and I will be honest here, because this story deserves honesty, was not the rumors, and it was not the letters. It was the loneliness of knowing something that I could not yet share. Every evening I sat in the library with Leander's books and Leander's chair and the low sound of the November wind against the old windows, and I held what I knew, that he had protected me, that everything was in order, that the architecture was in place, and I could not offer that knowledge to anyone, because the moment of its revelation had not yet arrived and would not arrive on my schedule. Patience. When you are tired and grieving and being systematically dismantled in the eyes of your community, is not a virtue that comes easily. It is a practice, a daily, deliberate, effortful practice. There were moments, I will admit, when I sat very still in that library and asked myself whether Leander had understood what this interim period would cost me, whether he had accounted for the weeks between the funeral and the resolution, the specific texture of standing in the crossfire of someone else's ambition while appearing to do nothing. And then I would look at his chair and I would remember the quality of his attention, the depth of his deliberateness, the fact that he had spent 40 years trusting Rafferty Cole with every significant decision he had ever made. And I would answer my own question. He had known, he had accounted for it. He had simply trusted me to hold, and now I want to ask you something directly. Not as an interruption, but as a genuine question from one person to another. At this point in the story, knowing what I chose and what it cost, do you think silence was the right weapon? Or would you have moved sooner, spoken louder, pushed back in ways I refused to? There is no wrong answer. I am genuinely curious what you would have done. Tell me in the comments. The call came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the funeral, when the first real snow of the season had arrived overnight and settled across the garden with the particular quiet authority of something that has been waiting for the right moment. I was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the way the snow erased the edges of things, the garden wall, the bare rose canes, the path between the house and the gate softening everything into a single continuous white, and I was thinking about how Leander used to say that snow was the most honest weather, because it covered everything equally and made no distinctions. He said it every first snowfall. I had heard it 21 times. I would have given a great deal to hear it a 22nd. The phone rang at 8. The number was a Greenwich exchange. I recognized not from having called it myself, but from having seen it written in Leander's handwriting in the small leather address book he kept in the top drawer of his desk. He had written it there years ago in his careful architectural script, alongside 2 words, Rafferty Cole. I set down my coffee cup. I picked up the phone, and the voice on the other end was exactly what I had imagined from a man who had spent 4 decades as the legal conscience of people who built things slowly and kept them carefully measured, unhurried, with the particular authority of someone who has never needed volume to be heard. He said, Mrs. Voss, this is Rafferty Cole. I think it's time we met. I had known this call was coming, and yet hearing the calm, specific weight of those words in that quiet kitchen, with the snow still falling outside and Leander's address book still open on the counter, I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief, precisely, something more layered than relief. The sensation of a door, long held shut against considerable pressure, beginning to open from the other side. I said yes. I said I could come at his convenience. He said Friday at 10, and gave me an address on Mason Street. And before he ended the call, he paused for exactly 1 beat, the pause of a man choosing his words with the same precision he gives everything, and said, he thought of everything. Mrs. Voss, I want you to know that. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that. The snow had begun to accumulate along the windowsill in a thin, even line, and the garden had gone entirely white, and the air inside the house was very still and smelled of coffee and cedar and something I could only describe as the particular warmth of being known, because that was what Rafferty Cole's words had delivered in 8 syllables. The confirmation that Leander had seen all of this coming, had mapped it, had answered it in the careful and permanent language of legal documentation. Before the question had even been formally asked, it was in that moment that I allowed myself, for the first time since the funeral, to cry. Not the public, contained grief of a woman receiving condolences, not the dry, sleepless ache of the middle-of-the-night hours I had become familiar with. This was something different, something that arrived from a deeper place, warm rather than cold, and tasted, improbably, of gratitude. I sat down at the kitchen table in the snowlight, and I let it come. And what I felt was not the grief of losing him, but the specific, overwhelming tenderness of being loved by someone so thoroughly, so farsightedly, so quietly, that his protection had outlasted his presence. He was gone, and he was still here, inside the architecture of what he had built around me. And I was only now understanding the full dimensions of the structure. I want to tell you about a moment I have reconstructed in my mind many times since, because I did not witness it directly, but Rafferty told me about it later, in the way he told me everything, with precision and without embellishment, and with a faint quality of reverence that even a 60-year-old attorney of considerable experience could not entirely suppress. 2 years before Leander died, on a Tuesday in September when the leaves had just begun to turn and the air had that first edge of autumn that fills, in Connecticut, like a door closing gently on one season before the next has fully declared itself, Leander had walked into Rafferty's office on Mason Street, sat down in the chair across from his desk, and placed a handwritten list on the table between them. The list was 3 pages long. It covered every asset, every account, every piece of property, every investment they had made together over 22 years. And beside each item, in Leander's careful, architectural handwriting, were instructions, specific, layered, legally airtight instructions about how each one was to be held, transferred, and protected. Rafferty told me that Leander had arrived with the list already complete, already annotated, as though he had spent considerable time, months, perhaps working through every contingency with the same methodical thoroughness he had brought to everything in his professional life. Rafferty had asked him, "Is there a particular concern driving this?" And Leander had been quiet for a moment, in the specific way that meant he was choosing his words. And then he had said, "I know my daughter, and I know what she'll do when I'm gone. I need Thessaly protected before it begins." There was also, Rafferty told me, a letter written in Leander's hand, sealed, addressed to Odell. Rafferty had been instructed to read it aloud at the appropriate moment, not to deliver it privately, but to read it in a room with witnesses at a time of Rafferty's professional judgment. Leander had known that certain things needed to be said in a specific way, in a specific setting, to carry the specific weight they deserved. He had known that a letter delivered quietly could be dismissed or refrained or simply ignored. But a letter read aloud by a man of Rafferty Cole's professional gravity, in a formal meeting room, with Odell's own lawyer present, that was a different instrument entirely. I drove to Mason Street on Friday morning, through streets still edged with Thursday's snow, the sky a pale and luminous white, the bare elms along the avenue, casting long thin shadows across the road. I wore a dark wool coat and Leander's favorite scarf, the navy cashmere one I had given him the first Christmas of our marriage, worn soft now with 2 decades of winters. I sat in the parking area outside Rafferty's building for 3 minutes before I went inside, breathing slowly, feeling the particular quality of a moment that has been a long time arrived. Then I walked through the door, and the warmth of the building closed around me, and the receptionist showed me to a conference room at the end of a carpeted hall, and Rafferty Cole stood to greet me, a compact, silver-haired man with the steady eyes of someone who has kept faith with difficult things for a very long time. He shook my hand. He said, "Mrs. Voss." He gestured to the chair across from his, and then he placed both hands flat on the table and looked at me with an expression that contained, I thought, something adjacent to the awe of a man who had known Leander Voss for 4 decades and had spent 2 years holding the weight of what Leander had left him, waiting for exactly this Friday morning. On the table between us was a manila folder, thick with documents, its edges perfectly aligned. He did not open it yet. He simply said, I want to walk you through everything before the other meeting. I want you to understand what he built. And I understood, in that moment, the full dimensions of what Leander had done. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Monday in December, 3 days after my private session with Rafferty, and by the time it arrived, the snow from the previous week had compacted into a hard, glittering crust along the edges of Mason Street that caught the winter light and threw it back in fragments. The conference room at Rafferty's firm was on the 2nd floor, a long, serious room with tall windows overlooking the street, a mahogany table that seated 8, and the particular hush of a space designed for consequential conversations. It smelled of old paper and furniture polish and, faintly, of the cold air that had followed us all in from outside. There were 4 chairs arranged on one side of the table, and 1 chair on the other. Rafferty had thought carefully about the geometry of the room. He always thought carefully about everything. I arrived at 1:45. Rafferty was already there, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the street below with the stillness of a man who has long since made his peace with waiting. He turned when I entered, gave a single nod. Not of greeting, exactly, but of acknowledgement, the nod of someone who recognizes that this moment has been a long time in the building and deserves to be received with appropriate gravity. He gestured to the chair on the far side of the table, the single chair, the one with the unobstructed view of the door. I sat my coat over the back of the chair. I folded my hands on the table in front of me. The folder was already positioned at Rafferty's place, closed, perfectly centered, its edges parallel to the edge of the table. I did not look at it. I already knew what it contained. Odell arrived at 2:02, which I suspected was deliberate, the small, calibrated lateness of someone who wants to enter a room already occupied rather than be found waiting in it. She came with 2 people, the lawyer from the first visit, whose name I had since learned was Prescott, and a second man I did not recognize, younger, carrying a laptop bag and the slightly effortful focus of someone junior who has been told this meeting is important. Odell herself was in a different coat today, deep burgundy, cashmere, the kind of color that communicates both confidence and occasion. Her hair was immaculate. Her expression, as she came through the door and registered my presence in the single chair across the long table, arranged itself into the particular combination of pleasantness and purpose that she had been wearing, in various configurations, for 22 years. She did not greet me. She greeted Rafferty, extending her hand with the smooth social ease of someone accustomed to managing first impressions, and said she appreciated him making time. Rafferty shook her hand with the brief, professional courtesy of a man for whom social ease is neither a goal nor a concern, and gestured to the chairs. They sat. Prescott arranged papers in front of him with the efficient movements of someone preparing to demonstrate calm. The younger man opened his laptop and positioned it at an angle. Odile set her handbag on the table beside her with the particular deliberateness of someone placing a marker. This is my territory, this gesture said. I am here and I am prepared and I am not surprised by anything in this room. Rafferty sat down. He did not open the folder. He looked at Odell for a moment with the level, unhurried attention of a man who has spent 4 decades reading rooms and people and documents with equal precision, and then he said, "Thank you for coming. Before we review the estate documentation, I want to be precise about the legal standing of each party in this room." His voice was measured and even a voice that had delivered difficult truths to difficult people for long enough that it had arrived at a kind of frictionless clarity. Not cold, but absolutely without softness. He said, Mrs. Cecily Voss is the sole named beneficiary of the estate of Leander Elliott Voss. This is not a contested position. It is the documented, witnessed, and legally executed position of a testamentary instrument revised and finalized 26 months ago. The air in the room changed. It was a physical thing, a slight, almost atmospheric shift, the way pressure changes before weather arrives. Odili's expression did not collapse. She was too practiced for that, but something behind her eyes moved, a rapid, almost imperceptible recalibration, like a navigator who has just been given a coordinate that does not match the map they brought. Prescott leaned forward slightly and said that they were prepared to contest the validity of any instrument executed during a period of, he used the word diminished, which sat in the room like something dropped from a height. Rafferty looked at him with the unhurried patience of a man who has been expecting exactly this and has prepared exactly the response it deserves. He opened the folder. The documents were arranged in sequence, and he read from them with the precise, unhurried cadence of someone who understands that in this moment, past his power, the will itself, first, its date, its witnesses, its notarization, its ironclad execution at a time when two independent physicians had assessed and documented Leander's full cognitive capacity. Then the trust structures, a series of instruments established over several years that had already transferred the majority of the relevant assets into Thessaly's name well before Leander's death, in a legal architecture so thoroughly constructed that contesting it would require not merely disputing a will but unraveling years of prior documented transactions, each individually witnessed, each individually sound. Prescott's pen had stopped moving. The younger man's laptop sat open and unattended. Odili's hands were very still on the table in front of her. And then Rafferty reached the last document in the folder. He paused, not for effect, or not only for effect, but with the quality of a man honoring the weight of what he was about to do. He said, "There is a personal letter written by Leander Voss, addressed to his daughter Odile, with instructions that it be read aloud in this context." He looked up from the folder, briefly, and his eyes moved to Odile, with something that was not unkindness, but was, perhaps, the closest thing to it that the situation permitted. He said, "I will read it now," and he did. "I will not repeat its contents in full. That letter belonged to Leander, and its words, once released into that room, became private in a different way, absorbed into the walls, into the silence, into the four people who heard them. What I will tell you is this: it was not angry. It was not punitive. It was written in Leander's voice, quiet, precise, and so completely, devastatingly honest that its kindness was the sharpest thing about it. He told Odile what he had observed. He told her what he had understood. He told her what he had chosen, and why, and with what love, not for the estate, not for the money, but for the woman he had spent 22 years building a life with, the woman he intended to protect with every legal instrument at his disposal. And in the final paragraph, in the careful, architectural handwriting I had known for over 2 decades, he had written something that I heard enter Odile like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. I did not watch her face while Rafferty read. I looked at the window. I looked at the winter light falling across the mahogany table. I listened to Leander's words in another man's voice, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very full, simultaneously grief and gratitude occupying the same space with the specific, impossible tenderness of things that cannot be separated. When Rafferty finished, the room held the silence for a long moment. Then he closed the folder. He set his hands flat on the table, and he looked at Prescott and said, with the finality of a sentence that has already been written, "I believe that concludes the substantive matters. If you have procedural questions, my office will respond in writing." Odile stood. She did not look at me. She gathered her handbag from the table with hands that were, I noticed, no longer quite still, and she walked to the door with the particular bearing of someone who is concentrating very hard on the physical act of moving through space with dignity. Prescott followed. The young man closed his laptop, the door opened, and the cold air of the hallway came briefly into the room. And then the door closed again, and they were gone. The room was very quiet. Rafferty sat across from me, both hands still flat on the table, and looked at me with the expression of a man who has just completed something he was entrusted to complete and feels, in this moment, the full gravity of that completion. I looked back at him. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then I said, "He was extraordinary." And Rafferty said, "Yes, he was." Before we reached the end of this story, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take a moment before you answer. Has someone ever underestimated you the way Odell underestimated me? Treated you as a category rather than a person, as a temporary arrangement rather than the real thing? If they have, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if you've been watching this story unfold and haven't subscribed yet, this particular moment right here feels like the right one. The thing about a storm is that the aftermath is never as loud as the event itself. The damage is quieter. It reveals itself in branches on the ground, in power lines down, in the way a familiar street looks suddenly rearranged. The Monday after that meeting on Mason Street, Greenwich felt different to me, not because the town had changed, but because the air was the same cold New England air it had always been. The winter light still thin and precise, the snow along the curbs still dirty at the edges. But the pressure I had been living under for weeks, the invisible weight of waiting, had lifted. What remained was something else. Not triumph, not exactly. Something calmer than that. Something closer to equilibrium. News of what had happened in that conference room did not spread quickly. These things never do, not in the way people imagine. There was no dramatic, public announcement. No grand reversal of the rumors Odell had so carefully seeded. Instead, there was a gradual, almost imperceptible readjustment. A shift in the angle of certain conversations, a softening in the eyes of people who had been watching me with that careful, assessing brightness. Those who needed to know had heard enough to understand that whatever challenge had been mounted to Leander's estate had not only failed, but had done so in a way that made further pursuit inadvisable. The letters stopped. The calls stopped. Prescott's firm did not write again. Odell, for her part, left town within the week. I know this not because I followed her movements. I had no desire to, but because Greenwich is the kind of place where departures are noticed. Her rental car was seen at the station. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, in a tone of rehearsed neutrality, that Odile had decided to return to the city, that she found the memories in Greenwich too heavy. I listened without comment. I thought of the look on her face when Rafferty read Leander's letter aloud, not the first half, when she had still been holding the shape of her own story intact, but the last 5 lines, when his words had reached the part of her that knew, however inconveniently, that he was not a man who wrote carelessly. I felt no satisfaction in that memory, only a quiet, complicated sadness for all the things that might have been different if she had been another kind of daughter. The family response arrived in fragments. A call from Leander's older brother in Boston. His voice rough with age and something like guilt as he told me he had heard there had been some unpleasantness and that he hoped I knew he had never doubted me. A card from a cousin in Chicago, thick cream paper with a simple line in blue ink. He chose you. We all saw it. I'm sorry it took some people so long to admit it. And Constance. Dear, earnest Constance. Appearing at my door again one afternoon with another covered dish and an apology she struggled to articulate an apology for having told me about the rumors, for having believed, even for a moment, that there might be more to the story than the quiet, solid marriage she had watched through our kitchen windows for 14 years. I told her the truth, that I was not angry, that she had done what a decent person does when they see something being twisted. She had brought it into the light. I did not tell her about the letter. I did not tell her about the trust structures or the timeline or the specific legal choreography that had unfolded in Rafferty's conference room. Those details belonged to a smaller circle. What Constance needed to know, what most people needed to know, was simple. Leander had been deliberate. I was protected. There was nothing more to be taken and nothing more to be given on that front. The rest of the story I kept where it belonged, inside the quiet architecture of my own memory. I went back to the house on Alderton Road, the way one returns to a book they had to put down mid-sentence. The first evening after the meeting, I walked through each room slowly. Not as an inventory, I had done that, in a different way, in my mind many times over the previous weeks, but as a kind of reintroduction. This sofa, that lamp, the faint dent in the hallway wall where Leander had once misjudged the width of the armoire. We were moving together on a rainy Sunday afternoon. The house no longer felt like a contested asset. It felt Again, like what it had always been. The place we had built together, out of deliberate choices and shared mornings and the thousands of small, invisible acts that constitute a life. The silence inside it was still sharp, but it was no longer edged with threat. It was just silence. In our bedroom, I opened the top drawer of Leander's dresser and took out the object I had been avoiding since the day he died. His watch, stainless steel, simple face, the same one he had worn almost every day of the 22 years I had known him. It was still set to the time he had last taken it off, as though the hands had been arrested by the loss of the rest they were accustomed to circling. I held it in my palm and felt the cool weight of it, the way the metal warmed slowly against my skin. I did not put it on. It was not mine to wear. But I placed it on the dresser in the small patch of late afternoon light that came in through the west-facing window, and I stood there until the light moved and the watch was in shadow again. It felt right that it should catch the sun at least once more. There is a peculiar freedom in knowing that a battle you did not choose has ended in your favor without you having raised your voice. It is not the exhilarating, chest-thumping freedom people write speeches about. It is quieter. It sits in the way you breathe in your own kitchen, in the way you walk through your own front door without that fractional tightening at the back of your neck, in the way your own name sounds in your own head when you are alone. Thessaly, Voss, widow, beneficiary, target, briefly, survivor, ultimately. Not because I fought harder than anyone else, but because the person I loved most in this world had chosen to wield the tools he understood best on my behalf. Signatures and clauses and seals and the unromantic, unglamorous machinery of the law. Winter in Greenwich lengthened. The snow came and went, freezing and thawing in the rhythm the town has always known. The temperature slipping in and out of freezing the way they do most years, sometimes dropping into the 20s at night, sometimes softening just enough in the afternoons to let the roads gleam wet and dark under a low sun. I settled into a new pattern, mornings with coffee and the paper at the kitchen table, afternoons in the library, reading or pretending to read, occasional dinners with friends who had weathered the rumors and chosen, without fanfare, to stand closer rather than step back. The house, the street, the town arranged themselves around this new version of my life with the indifferent, methodical grace that places have. Leander was gone. His protection was not Connecticut Visitor Guide +1. One evening, sometime in late January, I walked out into the garden at dusk. The air was cold enough that my breath came out in short white clouds, but not so cold that it hurt to inhale. The roses along the wall were bare, their canes dark against the snow, their thorns stark and unapologetic. I stood there for a long moment, looking at them, and felt the shape of the last 2 months settle inside me like something finally come to rest. Odell had left with nothing tangible, no house, no account, no claim, but she had not left empty-handed. She had taken with her a letter in her father's hand that she would not be able to unread, a mirror she would not be able to unsee. That, in the end, was Leander's true bequest to her. As for me, I went back inside, closed the door against the cold, and turned on the lamp by Leander's chair. The room filled with that soft, amber light I had always loved in winter, the kind that makes old wood glow and paint colors deepen. I sat down, not in his chair, but in mine, and picked up the book I had been pretending to read for weeks. I began again at the first page, and this time the words stayed. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches, making their own quiet music against the dark. Inside, the clock in the hall kept time. The watch on the dresser upstairs ticked in the dark, and I understood, fully and finally, what he had done for me. He had not only left me the life we had built, he had ensured that I would be allowed to live in it undisturbed. There's a particular kind of clarity that arrives only after the immediate heat of a conflict has cooled. Not relief, not vindication, not the giddy exhaustion of having survived a storm. Something quieter than any of those, a kind of still, lucid understanding, the latent evening realization that you have been living inside a story you were never quite allowed to see in full, and that the shape of it, when you finally see the whole thing, rearranges several smaller truths you had taken for granted. I am 58 years old, and I have lived long enough to understand that some of the most significant events of a life do not arrive with fanfare. They arrive in the shape of paperwork, in the quiet, unglamorous language of documents, in the courage of a man who chooses to protect you in the way he knows best and trusts you to live with the weight of that choice. Leander and I never had children together. I have thought about that over the years, in the way one thinks about a contour that defines a life without ever being named, not with regret, exactly, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the shape of our family was always going to be different from the one people expected. There was only us on one side, and Odile on the other, a daughter positioned by blood but not by temperament. A woman who never fully understood that the measure of belonging is not solely in the DNA, but in the 1,000 unspoken acts of loyalty that accrue over time. Leander knew this. He knew it down to the bone. And in the years when he began to see the weight of his own mortality, he understood that the most honest way to honor that knowledge was to write the story of his family in the language that would survive his voice. I have since sat with the full documentation of what he did, the trust instruments, the account transfers, the will revised in his own hand, the dates and notarizations, and the precise legal language that renders intention into something a judge or a lawyer or a disappointed daughter cannot simply talk away. I have read it not as a weapon, but as a kind of love letter written in the only idiom Leander fully trusted. He had never been a man of extravagant speeches, of public proclamations. He was a man of signatures, of dates, of witnesses, of the quiet, permanent architecture of a life carefully built. And in that architecture, every structural decision he made in the last 2 years of his life was a way of answering a question that had never been spoken aloud. Who belongs here when I am gone? The answer he gave was me. Some stories are too carefully true to be told carelessly. Someone sits with them, turns them over, chooses every word, decides which images will stay and which will be released. Understanding that the way a story is told alters the way it is remembered. I chose, in telling you this, to hold the sharpness of Odile's words and the weight of Leander's documents and the quiet, unadorned reality of my own stillness, because this is the story that actually happened. Not a cleaner version, not a more forgiving one. This one. The one that sits in the uneasy, illuminating space between a woman who underestimated her stepmother and a man who never underestimated her once. If there is a single truth I carry from all of this, it is this. Vengeance is not always a thing we do. Sometimes it is a thing that has been done for us, long before we knew we needed it. Leander did not live to see the disappointment in Odile's eyes when Rafferty opened that folder. He did not live to hear the careful, legal language that dismantled her claim the way he had dismantled complex financial structures over 4 decades. He did not live to see the quiet, matter-of-fact way the world rearranged. Once it became clear that the only person he had ever truly intended to protect was me. But that does not make his work less real. On the contrary, it makes it more so a quiet, deliberate, unshoutable justice that needed no applause, no courtroom, no headlines. It simply needed to be true. I sit in this house now with the windows holding the winter light in the way they always have, with the garden outside holding its own patterns of bareness and promise, with the same books lining the shelves he helped me choose, and with the same quiet in my own chest that has grown around the shape of his absence. The ache is still there. It is not the jagged, noisy ache of the first days. It is the quieter ache of knowing how much was given and how much was taken and how much of the giving outlasted the taking. I do not feel the need to embellish it. I do not feel the need to perform it. The story is already complete. The documents are filed. The deeds are recorded. The letters are read. The house is mine. The watch sits on the dresser upstairs. The roses will come back in the spring, as they always do. And if I am allowed one final, quiet truth, not as a widow, not as a beneficiary, not as anyone's second anything, but as the woman who knew Leander Voss better than anyone else in his life, then it is this. He saw me. Truly, fully, farther ahead than I saw myself, and he loved me enough to leave his revenge in the place where it would be the hardest to undo, not in temper, not in insult, not in scandal, in the quiet, ironclad, unshoutable truth of a man who knew exactly what he owed, and exactly to whom he owed it. That is the last sentence I will ever tell you about this story. The rest of it belongs to me and to Leander, and to the documents that already exist in the world, and to the people who chose to believe us after they saw the truth in black and white. The rest of it is no longer a story waiting to be told. It is simply the life I live in the house we built, the way he always intended for me to live it. And if you have listened to all of this, if you have sat with every word and every silence, then you already know the most important thing he left behind in the way he knew he would. A woman who, even when she did not speak, was never not there. A woman who stayed when others expected her to leave. A woman whose name, written in the only place he truly trusted the law, carried the weight of his love more honestly than any public speech ever could. That woman is me. And this is the story I chose to tell.